here. So I take it the sound's okay.
Yes, sounds good, looks good, everything's
Okay.
fine, and I'll introduce you properly now. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Randy Fertel, who has written a book that I have just finished reading, and then I'm going to introduce him properly and talk all about the book. But you're in New York, I'm just north of Boston. Ernie produces this out of Arizona, so we're kind of spread around. So let me just introduce you a little bit. There's a lot about you, so I'm not going to boil this down a little bit. Randy is a writer and philanthropist dedicated to the arts, education, New Orleans, and the environment. Randy holds a PhD in English and American literature from Harvard University and is the author of Winging It, Improv's Power and Peril in the Time of Trump. Please subscribe to my channel on YouTube and In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Ernie got the hard copy of the book. Normally I would hold it up. Do you have one right there?
Oh, you know, I meant to. Let me get it.
Good. Meanwhile, while Randy is getting that, I'll explain to anybody watching, if you see this Band-Aid here, it's just my latest brush with my dermatologist who biopsied something and we'll be checking it out. So don't worry about that. And so Randy, hold the book up, and I love the Bosch painting on the front. I told Ernie I get a lot of books to review and also to do things with, and I said, no, I never got the book. And when I bought it on Kindle, of course, I saw the cover and I said, no, this one I would have remembered because
I'll send you one. I'll send you one.
Yeah. So hold the title up, but also say the title so that we have people
Winging It, Improv's Power and Peril in the Time of Trump.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a lot about it. And I have a lot of quotes that I pulled out of the book to read because I can just go to the manuscript here. But let me set this up by saying, first of all, I thought it was a terrific book. I had no idea what this would be like until I read it. And I was just amazed at the kind of, range of information that you put in there, everything from literary illusion, Fred Astaire, but, art as a subject, and then, of course, the political thread with Trump. So what I'm going to do is try to introduce this just by saying that something about the book itself. And this is just lifted off Amazon, and then we'll get to actual quotes from the book, which we can then explore as we discuss. In Winging It, Fertel explores the wider landscape of popular culture and public affairs, ranging deftly from the unmediated experience in hookup culture, psychedelic trips, Fred Astaire's tap dancing, Franz Hall's brushstrokes, social media, and Hamilton's hip hop, to last though not least, the performative demagogic posturing of Donald Trump. And then I want to read a quote from the book. I think this is from page 63. I was trying to find something that kind of would get us into it. To understand improvisation's power and allure, we must understand the problem it seeks to solve. Improvisation may not truly be a different way of composing, but it always embodies a different way of knowing. It always seeks knowledge beyond reason's limits. And I just love that. And I love your writing. I just think it's terrific nonfiction writing, and so interesting to me. The range of your own reading and observation over the years is really in the book. And at the same time, there's a very strong through thread. And I love the way you've kind of talked about consciousness in terms of the more deliberative analytical side of science and the rest of it, as opposed to this kind of intuitive side that produces improv. And we think of that as comedy. And then, of course, you talk about Donald Trump in a way being an improvisational con artist. And pull the whole thing together. Anyway, that's enough of me talking. So let me first go to the book itself, ask you what the genesis of the book was. How did you pick the subject? How long was it in the process of being researched and written? And how did this book itself just come about?
Well, this book is the opposite of impromptu. Uh, it came um, it came out of a graduate seminar in Renaissance literature, and we had read this obscure pamphlet by Thomas Nash, and it was fun and it was freewheeling and free associative, and I loved it. And the professor, I think he meant absolutely nothing by it. I think he just meant to get the seminar started. He said, "I bet you've never read anything like this before."
Mm,
And I thought, well, no, it's like Tristram Shandy, and it's like this, and it's like
yeah,
that. And luckily, I didn't say anything out loud because I couldn't have explained how those formed a family resemblance, a genre
yeah,
almost, because they would have torn me apart because I couldn't have explained my
yeah,
intuition. But I stayed with it and wrote a paper on it and then a dissertation. And then, had a varied career teaching, and then I left teaching to work for my mother in a restaurant business in New Orleans, and it just wouldn't let me go.
yeah.
Like when I was working in the restaurant business, James Glick's Chaos, the Making of a New Science came out, and
Mhm.
I just loved it. And I'm one who avoided hard science courses at
Mm,
all costs. But I realized, oh no, I really enjoy the history of science, because I'm intrigued with the way the mind works.
mm,
And so I read it, and finally I realized, oh, I know why I love this book, because it helps me understand improv.
yeah,
So it came into my hopper, and so that's what happened. The reason there's such range in the book is because when you have this vision, this understanding of
mm,
something, when you come across another example of it,
yeah,
you find a place for it in that paradigm,
sure.
and it stays. And so people often remark the wide-ranging references. It's just because when I saw Frans Hals in Amsterdam,
Yeah.
it's like, oh man, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Mm, mm,
His roughness, his aliveness, his visible brushstrokes, the first in Western art.
yeah.
Um, and I real and that the crassness of some of his subjects. So the quote that you chose to introduce it was really good. But the one thing, and that was about reason versus intuition.
Sure.
But the one piece that I would add to that is instrumental, it is important to my definition, my
Mm,
understanding of improv, and that is that it's always disruptive.
yeah.
When a comic improviser gets on stage, or a group get on stage and do something totally impromptu, they have a prompt from the audience.
Mhm.
There's been no uh, planning,
Yeah.
and they build a narrative out of it.
Mm,
One thing they're saying without saying it is, hey, you in the mainstream art world, you work so hard.
yeah.
We're working hard,
Yeah.
but in a different way. But your work is based on, oh, you have to learn these rules, you have to imitate these masters. There's a decorum, there's a right way to do things. And if we can do this impromptu with just a three rule algorithm,
Yeah.
yes, and a couple others, then, all that rationality, let's throw it in the ditch.
Yeah.
So,
One thing that's
so for
interesting.
me,
Yeah. Go
improv
ahead.
is so sticky, and
Mhm.
it's stayed with us so long, and it goes so far back,
Mm,
because that's always an issue. There's always those people who are the artists, who go by the rules, and and um and the improviser comes along and says, "No, we can do something else." So
yeah. one that you make another point in the book that I guess ties into what you're saying, but also says that sometimes improvisation is is a little more organized than people think. When you write, I'm quoting you, you say, to achieve effortlessness is the oxymoron at the heart of improv. This charm and its premise of authenticity is the power behind the rhetoric of spontaneity. I thought that was a brilliant line, by the way, but also just so interesting in terms of just a look at the improviser. You talk about another place, you say the improviser alchemizes her charismatic bravado to create community. Improvisation's great theme, carpe vitam, sees not just the moment, but all of life, insists that by ignoring hierarchies, we embrace all of life, not only all of the experience, but of all our fellows. Thinking he could overcome received hierarchies by inspiring charity, carpe vitam was John Winthrop's theme in his sermon's final exhortation, quote, therefore let us choose life, that we and our seed may live by obeying his voice and cleaving to him, for he is our life and our prosperity. And then later in the book, well, not just later in the book, all through the book, you kind of then go to the dark side of improv and the kind of false spontaneity of Donald Trump that then you very accurately describe as a kind of a shtick. It's not really improv. It's like Kind of Blue, being given, which is an improvisational jazz album, but then when it's reperformed again and again and again, that sound is no longer as casual because now it's a concert, part of a concert menu. And of course, if you look at Donald Trump, he's a con artist, but he's also an improvisational artist that basically says,
and he has a concert menu. He has a concert menu.
Here's the concert menu. And you say something really, you say a couple of things that I've never seen before anywhere. And one of them is just that sort of his audience knows that you don't quite take him seriously, but they are angry. They would like to see the system broken. And you kind of tie that to something very clearly. And I guess it ties in with some studies you've done in another field in terms of the history of who served and who did not serve in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And having had a son who went right out of high school into the Marine Corps and fought in Afghanistan twice and once in Iraq at the beginning of that war and came back safely.
Good.
In 2004, thank God, lives across the street with 3 of my grandchildren that I do childcare for. So it all has a good ending. But I remember the sense of resentment I had of all my, this isn't directed at you, but all my fancy friends who teach or at Harvard or who went there in what I call the Volvo driving, sort of upper crusty northeast of the Boston area. And I was the only person in that circle. I'm a writer, so I get included in that circle, even though I'm not educated in that sense of Harvard and so forth. But I still bear some of that resentment in terms of trying to understand why you want to break the whole system and how unfair it seems. And, we hear a lot about the Rust Belt and all this other stuff, but I thought you were incredibly perceptive to tie it into the theme of military service and then people coming back. And then you have the statistic where you have 2 or 3 times the national average statistically of people who are vets who stormed the Capitol. So there are so many places we could dive in on Trump, but I'm choosing that arbitrarily. I just think it's such an interesting point.
Yeah. Well, you're right that comes out of my career in teaching. I taught the literature of the Vietnam War for many years. And you can't teach war narrative and poetry without stumbling on trauma psychology to help you explain how those narratives work. And so one of the things I'm arguing is that improv is a response to trauma. That, the 20th century popular culture, from jazz onward to rock and roll to hip hop to comic improv, it's come to be the dominant force in popular culture. It's how we do things. And, there are all these great guys, Belushi and, on and on, Robin Williams. Why? Why is it so sticky? Well, why do we keep going back to that? Well, one of the things about trauma is that you get stuck.
Yeah.
You get stuck in a narrative that you would like to find a new ending for, but you don't know how.
Yeah.
And people like Judith Herman and others argue that, the thing about trauma is that it pulls the rug out from, we all tell ourselves we have a story that explains our lives.
Mhm.
And trauma comes along and pulls the rug out from under that narrative because you didn't expect to be abused by your uncle or whatever, and or sent to a war that didn't need to be fought, by a country that prides itself on its righteousness. So that's very disturbing, and to come out of your trauma, and then the symptoms of trauma is hyper alertness because you're never sure when that's going to return, and uh, social withdrawal, a lesson or a condensation of the self. I'm not remembering the four pieces, but anyway, to get unstuck, you have to return to that traumatic event, and you need to understand it fully in order to rewrite a narrative that now includes the possibility that such a thing could happen. And so improvisers present this compensatory unstuckness. They are utterly impromptu. They are utterly in the moment. One thing about, hyper alertness, you're always back in the trauma, waiting for it to happen again. The improviser is free. He's in the moment. That's the key. And we all long to be in the moment, and it's the hardest thing. And Zen is always trying to get us there, and many other forms. But improv just does it. And watching it draws us into that. And as that quote says, creates community, because when they are, the yes and call and response form of improv, which means that you can't, if your partner says there's an ogre chasing me, you can't say there are no ogres. You have to go with it. You ask, well, does it have oily skin or does it have green skin? You just go with it, see where the narrative goes. And they do these astonishing things with that simple little rule. And all that is unstuck. It's another little thing to say about trauma is I recount, I think it's in the book about the Chowchilla kidnapping, where these 20 or so kids are put in kidnapped in a bus and buried. And one of the kids, only one, figured out a way to get out. He didn't get stuck. He didn't decompensate, and he got everybody out. And of the 24, he was the only one without trauma symptoms. So it's agency at the heart of it. If what improv promises is agency. We live in this metronome world. We live in such a rule-bound, regimented world. The tax man knows everything we've spent and earned. Social media knows every click. The NSA probably knows our last phone call. And to watch someone free of all that, if only on stage, is compensatory. It really opens us. That idea of carpe vitam, seize life, is one I stumbled on to explain this way that, yes, and if you are committed to not denying anything, then anything is subject, it can be made art. A wanton girl of the street in a Franz Hals painting, instead of a fancy dressed up Amsterdam gentleman. And so carpe vitam is a much richer concept than carpe diem. I realized this it was a epiphany when I realized, oh, carpe diem says seize the moment, seize the day, because it's evanescent, it's passing.
Yeah.
But carpe vitam says, seizing the day is a good thing, but let's seize everything. And, everything, it's true that everything is evanescent, but it's also true that everything is fecund with more, that nature is a cornucopia. And it, if we don't screw it up, it'll keep being a cornucopia. So I think improv also gives us that feeling that things are okay.
I want to turn the page and get into some of the things you talk about in terms of Trump. And I think this sort of sets it up well. I don't know where it's from, page 125. I mean, you get there before this, but you say, once you have opened the doors to the inspiration of external or instinctual forces, dampening reason's ability to judge, you never know who will take the helm, whether the force steering you will be divine or demonic, healthy or pathological, democratic, little d, or demagogic, big R. Hitler is the most monstrous example. In analytic psychologist Carl Jung's report, Hitler, quote, listens intently to a stream of suggestions from a whispered source and then acts upon them, end quote. How do you judge once you've dismissed judgment? And then at another point in the book, quite a few pages later, you say, in his final statement at the end of Trump's second impeachment trial, Congressman Jamie Reskin called attention to, quote, a pro-Trump protester who told his kids before leaving for Washington that he might never see them again, end quote. Thinking like a prosecutor, Raskin had considered presenting the protester's admission as proof that the violence was long planned. There was nothing spontaneous about the insurrection, but Raskin's daughter, Hannah, helped him see past the legal and political implications of the insurrection's farewell to his children. She saw the humanity the story carried and the moral implications. Quote, how can the president put children's people's families in that situation and then just run away from the whole thing, she asked. I love that story, but also just I was so surprised by how, I've been thinking about Trump a lot, and I've interviewed a lot of people, and I've written about this, and I speak about it, and I make my commentaries, and it has to be said. But I must say, I read more in your book that I think was new to me in terms of how to think about the rise of Trump in the context of improvisation as shtick, and the way you contextualized it within the art.
Shtick.
Yeah, powerful
shtick.
But I've got to tell people straight up that, if you really want to understand, I've been interviewed a lot about Trump because of my religious right background, and people want to know, why did evangelicals go for him? And your father was a leader. And like you, by the way, I carry around a lot of family behind me that I have sort of escaped from. So we have something in common. It wasn't steaks with me, it was theology, but lots of red.
I'll send my memoir to you too.
Yeah, do that, please. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that, I thought that this lens through which you have looked at Trump, actually, I've learned more about your thoughtful approach to Trump as an improvisational con artist, but in the use of artist also as an artist, as an improvisational artist, kind of feeding off the audience and so forth. I really think it's interesting because I've approached Trump very much through why did the religious right back him, or the forces of anger that put him there, or all these different analysis, the alienation of so many people in America from the American left and from what the Democrats have done, the kind of superciliousness of some of that basket of deplorables, etc. But I got to tell you, I think you've done some incredible original thinking on this, and that as people try to unpack what happened here, hopefully in the past tense, when Kamala Harris is president, nevertheless, I just can't tell you. I mean, I've thought so much about this, and there was so much new in your book that had never occurred to me before. I want to just congratulate you and just say, that's very powerful.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Very powerful stuff. And I hope that we can make this part of our book club. It has to be read in November.
I'd love that. Well, I wish it was in October because, I rushed it to press in hopes of having some impact, some little.
On the election. Yeah. Well,
But let me,
okay, I just got a message from Ernie, my producer, October then.
oh, great,
So
great,
yes, we will do it in
super,
October.
super.
But I just want to tell you, and so I have a question for you. That was a long
Uh,
rambling compliment. But how did you begin? I mean, how did you fold Trump into this?
yeah, okay,
And
so,
why? And then how come you have done this kind of thinking on Trump that I've never read anywhere else? And and so many things that have never occurred to me. You know, Fred Astaire and Trump in the same book,
yeah,
Franz
yeah,
Hals, his brushstrokes, and Trump's shtick.
yeah.
And I was doubtful as I dove in, thinking, oh man, how do you pull this together? And then at the end, it's seamless. I just cannot tell you how much of an impact it had on me.
Wow. So when Trump came down the golden escalator and I heard that first rant,
Yeah.
I thought to myself, oh my God, I knew there was a dark side to improv, but I didn't know it could get this dark. I wrote another book, Taste for Chaos, The Art of Literary Improvisation, a
Yeah.
rather academic book, but I'm proud of it. But it's, it's trying to make the case that improvisation has a larger role in Western canon than we usually give it. So and there's a dark side in there because, when Satan inspires Eve at the tree,
Yeah.
but Milton talks about infusing. Um, I forget the line, but and when Coleridge celebrates inspiration in Kubla Khan, at the end of the poem, he's saying, "Weave a circle round him thrice, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise." So um, when because I have this lens, when I heard Trump, I was prepared to hear that rant as very poisonous milk of paradise talk. And I committed right then to I had just published the academic book, and I committed right then, listen, I've got to write a book for a general audience because this isn't too important to leave to the academics.
Yeah.
So I founded a improv conference, which we held at the Jazz Museum in New Orleans for 2 years until COVID came along, and it was across the discourses, music and art and literature and politics, and I sent out a email blast about the political panel, which had some great speakers. And I got an email back from a very distinguished jazz historian from Rutgers who said, why are you making improv look bad? It's not bullshit. And, this was in the middle of Trump's presidency. I just couldn't believe he could say that. How do you miss that? It can't, Louis Armstrong, my homeboy, I'm from New Orleans, was the greatest improviser of the 20th century, and he's in all my books because he invented the improv solo, and there's this great story about. Well, I won't go there, but anyway, so I made that, and I learned a lot from those conferences. And on Mardi Gras morning 2020, the way into this new book came to me, and I decided not to go to Mardi Gras, which turned out to be the first super spreader event. There were 80,000 infections. So this book probably saved my life, and I hope it helps save the democracy.
Well, it's interesting, but the insights into Trump within the context of this book on improvisation, I think it's just brilliant because it's something that it really gets to the heart of his own shtick, his style. You say, you recognize another thing, and that is the trauma of the Trump years and surviving that. You say, dealing honestly with the trauma of Trump is the first step toward healing the divide, telling our truth and listening to the truth of both tribes is an important step on the road to recovery. If dark improvisation has deeply wounded civil society, I like that, dark improvisation, because that's it.
Yeah.
If dark improvisation has deeply wounded civil society, the way forward is not to stop improvising, but to really listen learning from the best improvisers, comics, scientists, musicians, dancers, and the founding fathers, our best listeners. I love that piece of the book. And I think that, what that kind of does for the reader is to put Trump in the context of a wonderfully large history and therefore give some context to this aberrant moment of American history, and tie it into something bigger than simply politics. And that is a manner of personal improvisational style of this political leader whose strength, if you want to put it that way, is that he never had a plan. And so I want to go to a political question that doesn't come directly from your book, but I'd love your insight on it. And that is that it just seems to me that, speaking of people whispering into your ear, that Trump, being a bit of a cipher with no plan and a total improviser, part of his improvisation is if you hand him a script and say, do this, say, appoint these judges to the federal bench, because we've got a list we put together for the last 50 years in the Federalist Society, or do this, Project 2025, whatever, that kind of emptiness of the improviser suddenly handed a script. It's like, okay, I'll sign off on that. He's not even going to read it.
Yeah. Or someone prompts him to worry that he's losing the suburban women. So all of a sudden he decides that he's pro-choice.
Yep.
And, he's a man without any ideology, without any inside. It's all outside. What we're talking about is the mystery of Trump, how he can control 30-40% of the American electorate. It's very scary. But improv is, and everyone has their little piece of that explanation. You mentioned a bunch of them. My little piece that I have to add is improv, that the rhetoric of spontaneity. Listen, I'm not reading a prompter. I'm not writing white papers. Trust me, only I can do it. Mm-hmm. I've given this no thought because my brain knows better than many. My gut, he says, knows better than many brains, which is the ultimate, the key improv gesture. My instincts, my intuition is better than rationality. So when he came out, when he became president, there was, or maybe in the campaign, there was a lot of commentators saying, oh, he's so improvisational. And then they dismissed him, like, how unpresidential. Yeah. Well, it may be unpresidential, but it sure is effective. Yeah. And now we have Kamala. Yeah. Now we have Kamala, and she's an incredible improviser. I say at the end of the book, as you read, the point is not to throw improv out with the bathwater. Right. It's to sequester bad improv and get back to this glorious joy and laughter that Kamala brings. I've been writing about it on my blog and having a lot of fun. She's just given me such great material.
Well, and by the way, we will link to that everywhere. Just tell Ernie, our producer, what you would like to have us get people reading, and we'll link to anything you send us.
Great. Thank you.
One of the things you say that I think is this sort of juxtaposition to improv, and that, your shtick is, hey, I don't have a script. I don't have any plans. My gut tells me everything. And then, of course, you run into the brick wall of a fact-based reality. And you write about that when you say that Trump's administration failed quickly to produce and disseminate a scientific test for coronavirus should not surprise. To test is to measure, a rational exercise, better to measure by hunches and imagery, imaginary numbers that his base finds easy to swallow and that support his fragile ego. The quants of Wall Street found hunches less appealing and the Dow tumbled. So, you do have these passages where you talk about Trump in terms of, okay, here's the theory of Trump, and then all of a sudden he runs into reality. But then, of course, he just begins to riff again on that. I mean, he'll come up with that, whether it's pro-choice one week, pro-life another, whatever it may be. And then, of course, COVID, still is very much in my mind, and how he just went from one thing to the next and never did come up with a policy that actually saved lives.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
and then you
mine
put,
would,
thus we get what we deserve. We may, like the pirates, soon sleep with the fishes, or perhaps like General Miley, contemplate a hangman's noose. You know, you have a very dark vision of how that all worked out. Anyway, back to you.
yeah, I'm forgetting what I was going to say.
Talking about Trump's improvisation running into a fact-based universe.
Yeah, thanks. So here's the thing. If you're honest about it, one thing our beloved comic improv has in common with alt facts is that they make up things, right?
Yeah.
If an ogre is chasing me, that's an alternative universe. But they do it in a spirit that's fun and for the purpose of getting some interesting narrative to emerge. Trump does it to manipulate.
Yeah.
So you, in one of the first things you read from the book was about community, how
Yes.
improvisers build community. So when that ogre is chasing them, people get into the play and follow the leaps as they do call and response. The same happens with Trump, but there's this cult like uh, total loss of rationality. Once you've once you've thrown rationality into the ditch, how do you judge? How do you judge facts and alternate facts? But the point I'm making is that there's a link between this playful make believe and Trump's very dark, manipulative make believe, alternate facts.
Yeah.
We live in such a scary time. But you talked earlier about tribalism and getting past it through listening. And I'm very, very concerned about, the state of the union because of this. And the book ends with a plea to try to listen to our fellows because they had a complaint and he listened to it better than we did.
Yeah.
And I used the play The Bacchae from Euripides to show this cult-like intoxication and the emergence from it. And it comes through listening. And they need to listen to us, which won't be easy because they're in this alternate world. But I hope our new president addresses this somehow, improvises some way to address this. It's really 30%. And as an educator, I can't not attribute this to not having any care for education true, real education in America. Ever since the beginning of public education, which was largely just to create mill workers, to feed the industrial complex. And, people like me who fall in love with learning can forget that most people are not really being given critical thinking skills, and that's much in need.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that lacks about a lot of our educational aims in the United States is there's not a kind of an idea of the intrinsic worth of beauty, so that you can go through the entire American school system and you study things that you have to study always with some end in sight of getting a job or making money.
Utility.
But there's no sense of the intrinsic joy and beauty of the subject itself. That seems to me, I've got 3 grown kids and 5 grandchildren, and if there's something that you're always fighting in terms of all school systems, it's get away from the utilitarian view of knowledge and get back to the idea that, the reason I leave art books all over the table and have them open to different pages so that they know something and play music is not because I want them to pass an exam or that they can put that on a college application and do something. That's the moment itself, that music's playing and you're looking at an art book or you're going to a museum or you've got paintings on your wall. And that it just seems to me that that sense of the intrinsic worthwhileness of life itself is what's missing from the whole package. And that once you get into that sense of intrinsic worth of the subject or the beauty or the knowledge or the pursuit of information, then it just changes everything. And then you're not going to be open. So in a weird way, part of the appeal to Trump, and I'm just riffing here from your book, would be the kind of intrinsic worth of enjoying Trump as an entertainer and saying, well, I relate to him.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge. That's a good one. Man, he is something. He is really something.
Yeah. So let me reintroduce you. Randy Fertel, hold your book up again when you're done with your coffee. Sorry. Holds a PhD in English and American Literature from Harvard University, and he is the author of a wonderful book that I have been reading called Winging It. He's holding it up here with an Hieronymus Bosch painting. Improv's Power and Peril in the Time of Trump. And, one thing that I would like to talk about is go to a quote here that I want to read from the book, and that is, to explain the immovable devotion of Trump's supporters in the face of his legal peril and unhinged public statements, I return to my central contention, Trump's subconscious channels the dark, destructive energies of trickster Dionysius. What Sri Lankan presidential advisor said of the social media inspired genocide in his country is a metaphor that helps explain Trump's role, we don't completely blame Trump, the germs are ours, but Trump is the wind. It's very brilliant, but I love that we see him as the trickster and that it's tied into the myth, Greek and other mythological beings that go back in our history. One thing I love about your book is that you place Trump in a large context of culture and history that is not just American history, but just the phenomena of the trickster and this character that emerges. And of course, you talk about other leaders that get mentioned. But talk a little bit about that context, that historical context of the trickster, the improviser, but the trickster. Because I like that.
So I was trying to, at the beginning years ago, I was trying to understand what links these things that I feel are somehow the same.
Yeah.
And I finally realized that at the heart of them is the persona voice and of trickster. That was a real boost. It really helped me understand a lot. And then, then realizing that there's a dark side, that, Hermes is the friendliest of gods.
Yeah.
But Dionysus, his cousin, is, he in that Bacchae that I mentioned, because the Pentheus, this hyper-rational king of Thebes, refuses to acknowledge his godhead, he gets his Pentheus's daughter and Dionysus's cousin, whose name escapes me right now, intoxicated, and they go off into the woods, and Pentheus follows them because he's curious, and his daughter, intoxicated, decides that he's a lion, and she tears him apart and eats his flesh, and that's the kind of people would have hung Pence on January 6th.
Yes.
With utter righteousness.
Yeah.
That's intoxication.
Yeah.
So to the end of tribe, or to address tribalism, you've got to bring down people from this trip they're on.
Yeah.
And the chapter on psychedelics is worth noting here. But
Yeah. And you, by the way, your story of saying, "Am I going to be sick? Feel this way for 4 hours," and then he says, "No, it's going to be 5 hours," or you discover it's 5 hours. That your psychedelic experimentation didn't work out for you very well that time.
No.
Good story.
Thanks.
Hey, so you write a media savant, Trump faked his way through one of the most consequential presidencies in American history with off-the-cuff tweets and policies developed on the fly. Like improvisers since antiquity, he used the impression of his improvising, the persuasive power of spontaneity, as spoof of his naturalness,
Oh,
authenticity, and
it should
authority.
be proof of his.
I mean, proof. I said spoof.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I misread it.
I thought it was a
As
misspell.
proof. Yeah, there's no misprint. It's in my eye. The misprint's in my eye. As proof of his naturalness, authenticity, and authority. His improvising gave him the authority to break norms and laws. His transformation of American politics was, well, huge. Great listening is one of improvisers' secret powers. And alas for the Republic, Trump was attuned to the MAGA crowds and adjusted his speeches and policies based on applause and tweets. And I just think that's a fantastic summing up of what we all really experienced, in terms of what was true about that. But also, once again, you give us a new angle. This improviser, this trickster, tied into mythology and the characters and the tricksters in the mythological tales and so on. There's a whole nother way of approaching Trump, and your book does it, and has left me much more informed and thoughtful than I've been for a long time, because my thinking about Trump has become sort of circular, and you've helped me break out of that and see him in a different context.
Well, that's a great compliment. Thank you.
Anyway,
one of the things you said reminded me of the quote that I stumbled on just before publication from Oscar Wilde, that spontaneity is a meticulously prepared art.
Yeah.
And so, people push back when I say that Trump is an improviser. They say, "Oh, he's not smart enough."
Yeah.
And my reply is, listen, there are all kinds of smart.
Yeah.
And one kind of smart is where, it's not intellectual, it's not rational. It's the id. The id, if you're, where do myths live? They, mythic figures live in the id, in the subconscious.
Yeah.
And Dionysus is always ready to pop out. Trump read a few Hitler speeches, as we know, and he got some hints there. And I guess he had some of those minders gave him other ideas, but mostly I think it's from his gut, like he says. His gut knows more than many brains. But the problem is what he knows, which is how to manipulate.
Well, you jump into that fairly early in the book. I have a quote, I don't know, page 30 or something. Unschooled, Trump presents himself as the, quote, natural man, authentic, free of politicking, artifice, trustworthy. Trump's embrace of folly as persuader harks back to the Renaissance, when the former monk and priest Erasmus claimed that his mock oration, praise of folly, quote, is unpremeditated, but all the truer for that, end quote. Embracing speed and carelessness, Erasmus was aiming at the scholastics, or schoolmen, followers of Aristotle and Aquinas, remembered mostly for long debates about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead called their reign, quote, the rationalistic orgy of the Middle Ages, end quote. We call them the Dark Ages, but they were lit up by cold cognition. So I want to go into that. You talk about cold cognition, and then what's the opposite of that?
Hot cognition.
So, and of course, improvisation is hot cognition. So that's one of the basic points in your setup of the whole book. And of course, I'm doing this out of order, but let's go there for a minute and just talk about those two ways of seeing.
So in this quest to understand improv, to just open myself up to what is this thing?
Yeah.
I stumbled on all the advances in neuroscience.
Yeah.
And they have just really opened it up for me. It used to be left and right brain. The right brain was the creative, left brain was the rational. Now they've decided it's not hemispherically located, but still there are these two kinds of mind within our skull,
Yeah.
and two kinds of ways of attending to the world. And cold cognition is the predictive function. It's basically the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And if you're having dinner on the lawn, and someone says a tiger's coming,
Yeah.
you check the past and you say there was no tiger yesterday. There are no tigers in New York.
Yeah.
Fuck that. Excuse me. And so cold cognition becomes a little munchy for the tiger. Hot cognition may have embodied emotions, feelings before the concept of tiger even gets into his head, or
Yeah.
the word run gets into his mouth. He's running before he says run. And that's because it's the limbic brain and the reptilian brain, which is tuned into everything around you in the moment. So the hot cognition's job is to deal with the moment, that thing we would love to deal with, but which reason tells us, you got stuff to do. So improv, I argue, is an incredible tapping of this power, hot cognition. Now, the other twist to this neuroscience is that social media is empowered by it. All those likes, all those dopamine hits when you get a like or befriended, that feeds your hot cognition, and you go back for more. I have a chapter on social media, and I realized how evil it can be.
Yeah.
And so I weaned myself off of it. And then when I published the book, it was like, how do you wrote a book without social media? So
Yeah.
I hired someone to do a lot of the work, but I kept going back for those likes, for those dopamine hits. I want to see, oh, did people like that piece?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and the neuroscience helped me, and has helped others. It's not all my work, but helped me understand how social media exploits that dopamine hit. They call it a Las Vegas casino in your pocket. Your iPhone is a.
Yeah. You talk about the fact you say, according to his worldview, we can make America great again by rejecting the best and brightest, the elites. Instead, we should follow Trump's gut. As Selena Zito argued, quote, the press takes him literally, but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously, but not literally. The MAGAs know Trump is selling shtick, but believe what he means is, just as I am now breaking the norms of civic discourse, I'll break political norms to bring jobs back home. They may know that Trump's promise to save the coal industry is empty, but they trust his promise to care for those whom Hillary Clinton dismissed as deplorables. Each tweet, according to The Atlantic, was, quote, a fragment of presidential id, end quote, that fed on and fed his base's anger. And then you continue at another place, it's counterintuitive that the embrace of folly has the power to persuade. It's absurd that a reality show host and a serial liar with a spray tan can strike anyone else as authentic. And yet in Trump's hands, smart is stupid and stupid is smart, the way back to an imagined American paradise before the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. Trump's claim of spontaneity and its resonance with his base has pulled us into an alternate universe where values and norms of democracy and civic life, reason, expertise, evidence are seen as the problem, not the solution. And I just had a question for you because, of course, your embrace of the spontaneity and the creativity of improv, improv itself not denies reason, but builds from it. But Trump's shtick makes war on reason as evidenced by his lack of planning and foresight and direction in the COVID pandemic. How do you see those two things balancing in terms of creative life? Because having just written this book is not improvisational, but I'll bet you that up until you almost had to lock it to go to press, you were including quotes, because as you ran across something, you wanted to include it, because that's the improvisational part of creation. It's not locked down. It's like, oh, wait, here's an even better quote.
Yeah.
Here's something I hadn't
Yeah.
thought of. And I'll bet you're that kind of person.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like listening to your I forget his name, Josh Sobel, was that his name? The podcast about MLK.
Yeah,
I remember the improvisational moment in the famous "I Had a Dream" speech, because
yeah,
I don't know if you know, but you probably know that he was kind of stumbling along. The speech hadn't really caught fire yet,
yeah,
and Mahalia Jackson, who could have been a neighbor of mine, she grew up near my house in New Orleans.
yeah,
She yelled out, "Tell him about your dream, Martin."
yeah, yeah,
And she apparently had heard him talk about that dream.
yeah,
And so he did, and he improvised that incredible thing that is quoted a million times.
yeah,
So I, rope him into my improv world. I think that, and at the heart of improv is opportunism.
yeah,
Opportunism has a dark meaning, but it just means seizing the moment
yeah,
and going through the door. Port
yeah,
is at the heart of the word. And Hermes is the lord of the threshold. He controls getting through things, and he knows how to get through doors that don't have locks or that do have locks. And the opportunist seizes the moment. And so that's what MLK did in Birmingham and Selma and Detroit. And out of that came um, uh, for a moment, the end of Jim Crow.
yeah. I mean, one of the most serious things you've got in your book in terms of just a predictive, serious statement, you say democracy has always been susceptible to trauma induced by demagogues whose first role is disruption. And people don't get that about Trump. This is not a builder. This is a destroyer.
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson, Huey Long, Father Charles E. Coughlin, Joseph McCarthy. America always had a white supremacist guardians of the quote lost cause. Trump gave them permission to come out of their woodpile. I love that, because that's the deal. Trump's quote alternative facts and fake news were a direct assault on truth. To assault truth, personal or communal, is traumatizing. And I really think that one of the, I mean, there are many brilliant things in your book, but one of them is just this emphasis of shtick, trauma, and the deliberate effort to induce trauma, because Coughlin and McCarthy and all these other people knew they were traumatizing listeners who were on the other side, and deepening that division somehow solidifies the Trump base even more. And it's not new in history, but I just think that the way you set it up is, tremendous insight. Really, what I like so much about what you do talk about, I mean, I'm sorry that in this interview we followed the thread of Trump too much, but we're coming up to the election, so sorry, but there you are.
No,
But the other thread on improvisation itself is brilliant. The artistic, you talk about Louis Armstrong and jazz and New Orleans, and of course, Fred Astaire and the painters, but just philosophically, what improvisation does for art. And that's a whole other book in your book. And I'm glad when people read it, they're going to understand the richness of that. And in a way, it makes reading about Trump easier, because so often when we read about Trump, it's so dark and so depressing. But I love this because there are so many glimpses of light. It's as if, okay, here's Trump, but by the way, here's this beautiful, story about this philosopher or this poet or this stand-up comic or this musician. Almost the other half of your book is telling us why we should fight Trump, because this other world is worth fighting for.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Yeah.
And I really think
I'm arguing that to understand Trump, you have to understand that he's the other side of a lovely coin.
Yeah.
He's not the side you want to get when you flip it, but sometimes you get it.
Yeah.
You know, that jazz historian who said, you know, improv isn't bullshit. Well,
Yeah.
sometimes it is.
Yeah. You talk about the fact that in periods of paradigm shifting, improv has functioned like those unelected bacteria to help redefine rationality, feeling an imbalance in reason's dominion over mind. Improv prioritizes behavior that is unthought and undeliberated. Improvisation broadens rationality's toolkit by metabolizing lesser non-cognitive human faculties, instinct, intuition, and embodied emotion. Improvisers are called to this enterprise of redefining rationality because cold cognition behaves dismissively to, quote, lesser faculties and cuts them off at the corpus callosum. Reason rules the roost. Improv seeks to knock that cock right off. We like to think rational decisions shape our lives, but in fact, instincts, appetites, and accidents have an equal role. And of course, then you use that to explain some of the fascination with Trump by his followers, but of course, it's also a positive part of the story. And I love how you illustrate that. You say, we may marry for prudential reasons, but lust or greed, or hopefully that most irrational emotion, love, is part of the story. Why marry him and not another? Yes, he's attractive, but who put him in your way on the street that day? Accident. What of that man who inhabits the next street, but whom you haven't met? Should you wait for another accident? Unthought, unspoken, unbodied desire, longing will help you decide. I love the insight of that paragraph. And I just like the paragraph so much I wanted to read it.
Thank you, Frank. Well, that's really moving for me because that's not one that I knew would land.
Yeah, well, it landed with me.
Great. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm interested on the personal side before we wrap this up. You know, you come from an interesting family. There was a lot of conflict. I've read some articles about that, and you allude to that in one part of the book, talking about that you worked with your mom. But I'm more interested in another journey you had that I've read about you, and that is I think that you're and maybe I'm reading into this, but I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out who I am in the context of, as it were, almost escaping from a definition of what my life should have been because I was the son of this famous evangelist and I made my own choices and departed. And you know, maybe that's for a cup of coffee sometime when I'm in New Orleans or New York and we can talk about it. But I just wonder if you, you know, I'm 72 years old. And I know you've had a lot of things happen in your life, but as I look back, and one of the reasons I appreciate your book so much, I mean, at this time of my life, it's kind of, well, what do I regret and what don't I regret? And what I don't regret are the experiences of beauty and connection with other people to whom you drew close, who lasted and went the distance with you, as opposed to those severed relationships when you were leaving something and wanted to re-identify yourself. I know that sounds complicated, but I figured I'd say that to you because your personal story and the kind of conclusions you're drawing in this book, I think, show a lot of life wisdom. And somehow that journey must inform this.
Well, you don't get hooked on something for 50 years like I did, and not wonder why.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure this addresses what you're asking, but that family journey of having this hyper rational mother, a math whiz, math science whiz, and then a astonishing businesswoman, who wasn't the warmest person, not the greatest mother. And then to have a crazy father like I did, a guy who was independently wealthy and looked around for things to do and decided at one point to run for mayor of New Orleans on the platform the zoo needed a gorilla.
Yeah.
And he was a nut. He was a trickster, kind of a con man. You know, he would tell me, "Oh, go steal this." He was from another world.
Yeah.
And the first feeling was, oh God, how did I get in this family? And the second feeling was, how do I integrate this.
Yeah.
And improv, I think in the end or in the beginning, improv hooked me because it's dealing with that hyper rational, the hyper rationality and irrationality, and
Yes.
trying to reconcile them.
Yeah.
And like the last quote says, it's trying to integrate them.
Yeah.
And so I think that has been my journey, and
Yeah.
so I carry them on my backs and
Mm.
thank them for this lovely book that I'm very proud of.
Yeah.
Though I could have wished for better parenting.
Yeah, no, you and I share that, and we share that. I think people ought to be aware of your tenderness towards beauty itself and toward art. So I'm going to read something before we wrap up here. Just say, hey, one time, let's see, 40, 50 years ago, I was in Preservation Hall and listening to some music there, and one of the women playing the piano, who at that point was, I think, in her 80s or whatever, and I'm so sorry I don't have her name handy. But I talked to her, and of course, you met people who were of an age that had known everybody
Yeah.
and played with everybody at some point. It was a very I don't know, it was kind of a stunning experience to be there with her. She had accompanied, she knew Louis Armstrong and some others, and of
Wow.
course you
Wow.
know all these people, but it had a big impact on me. And now I want to read something from your book that had an
Oh,
impact on me, and in a weird way showed me more about who you are and what you care about. It's almost like I finished this book thinking he would have rather just write a book on improvisation, but God damn it, because we've got to all do something about Trump, he folded that in, and he did it very well and successfully. But someday he'll write another book where it's
I
like,
do have
God,
a third book.
yeah, where
Yeah.
we'll just leave Trump in the dust of history
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah.
move on to this. So let me read this about Franz Hals, who I like his paintings very much. Gypsy Girl, 1628, Musée de Louvre, Paris. I don't know if Hals and Holbein had been the younger, if Hals had Holbein the younger in his crosshairs, but Holbein carefully crafted brush-free portraits from a century earlier exemplify what Hals is pointedly not doing. His exquisite portrait of a Dutch merchant, a member of the, I can't pronounce this, Wadi family,
Yeah. I don't know.
is as static as Hals' portraits are dynamic. The inscription giving the year 1533 and the merchant's age 39 fixes it, makes it a timeless icon. Holbein extensively used preliminary drawings, which he would transfer to canvas. Egg yolk tempera were then layered with tiny brushes so carefully that no brush strokes are visible, which of course is what Leonardo used to do as well, not with the tempera, but the no brush strokes. By means of such careful method, Holbein the Younger leaves behind his father's Gothic portraiture and helps usher in the Northern Renaissance, of which, like Hals, he is a key figure. Hans Holbein the Younger, a member of the thing, and then you show the picture. And then you talk about the Franz Hals. Hals, and I'm moving forward, has caught her, this girl, in a moment complete with sideways leer and generous cleavage. Curators' probes reveal that Hals repainted her décolletage to make it more seductive. Hals' maiden is surely not a member of the rising capitalist class, not among those likely to commission portraits to display their wealth. What does that say about her portraitist and how he spent his time? Apparently, he didn't curry favor at court among the decorous, orange-sashed courtiers his near contemporary Rembrandt famously painted. And I love that. It was basically, we're talking about Trump and we're looking at our politics. And then suddenly it was like, okay, I'm going to put this book down on Trump and just go look at a painting. And then I suddenly realized after I read that, no, you're not looking at the painting, you're hearing it described. And I read quite a bit about art, and I just think you write beautifully about art.
Thank you. Thank you. And I love to put together odd comparisons. And
Yeah.
right before that, Franz Hals piece is a description of Johnny Vodakovich, this great drummer in New Orleans, who once told a student, he teaches at Loyola, he told a student to play for him, and the guy played. He said, yeah, he's got that New Orleans accent, And he said, yeah, you're a very competent drummer, but my job's going to be to slop you up.
Yeah,
So to
I like
slop
that.
you up. And
Yeah,
that is so expressive of what improv does. So
yeah,
why? Why is that so sticky? Why is that uh, been the dominant force
yeah.
of popular culture since at least the jazz era? My third book is going to explore popular culture.
I
Um,
love that.
how perhaps since minstrelsy, maybe minstrelsy was the first global
Mhm.
art, and then on up the line, it's just slopping up step by step. And
Yeah,
so,
well, make sure you let me know when that's out because I'll
yeah,
be your first customer.
thank you.
Hey, one last question.
Yeah,
What do you think would be most helpful in trying to break the spell? Ernie, my producer, Ernie Gregg, says of all Trump's ogres, quote unquote, what would break the spell in terms of his followers being under because he paints these portraits of the enemy, whether it's the gay community or white or black people or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Ernie and I are always sort of debating this in terms of just who our guests should be and what we can do about this. How do you look at this as someone who's really perceptive about this? I mean, is there any hope of breaking the spell of enough of these
Oh,
folks before the
yeah.
election, or at least in terms of history? I mean, what breaks these sorts of spells?
Um, I'm hoping that Kamala's magic does it. Um,
Yeah.
I think she's going to win some people over. Will there be a landslide of people, coming out of their hallucination? I don't know. I doubt it.
Yeah.
It's a powerful hallucination, and you know how that works
Yeah.
um, with
Well,
your
give me
background.
a give me a picture of the book one more time. Let's hold that up
Sure.
and tell people that's going to be in our October book club, Winging It. And we are going to be talking about the book again before the election because we put it in the book club in October. And is there anything you'd like to add? And do me a personal favor. When I say goodbye and ring off, please you stay on for a minute and talk to my
Yeah.
producer, Ernie, because we want to make sure we've got everything you need done in terms of linking to what you want to link to. But also, we always ask our guests, and we've gotten some phenomenal tips this way. If having been interviewed by me and my interest in your book, you're thinking, gee, Frank ought to talk to so and so, whether it's an author or it could be anybody. It
Ah,
doesn't have to be a
ah,
well-known person. If you give us a couple names of people that you think we should know about, please stick around for a couple minutes with Ernie
yeah.
when we say goodbye. Would you like to add anything about the book or the world or Trump or the election or
Oh,
anything?
this has been delightful and very thorough and very generous, and I'm not sure that I have anything to add. Thank you.
Well, you're a surprising person because you've combined a bunch of subjects that are never put together and you've got a wonderful alchemy. I want to read other things you've written. I can't wait for the next book. Um, and I just want to thank you. This has been great.
Well,
So,
I'll end with my rather wry, meant to be wry definition of dilettante.
mm,
That a dilettante is a polymath that didn't add up to much.
yeah,
And I like to think that my books are, what I've added up to. It's great to do a dump into something that will last, and
yeah,
that's what the books try to do.
yeah. Well, I love the book. And you judge a book, you don't know enough to know everything that the writer's writing, but there's enough in your book of things I really do know something about. Franz Hals being one of them, and other things, and many other things you allude to. So I can just tell readers that, I mean, if you read a description of an area you live in and they get it wrong, then you
Yeah.
think, well, maybe everything else in the book is wrong.
Oh,
But the
yeah.
descriptions of the areas that I live in, which
Uh-huh.
is doing something about Trump and loving art and loving music, everything that I know a little about that you talk about, you got 100% right in things that I do know something about. And I trust the rest of it. And I love the writing. I just love it. And it was so
Well,
easy to read because you
well,
took me through everything.
thank you for the compliment about the writing, but I will kind of pass it along to my improvisers, because you can't read improvisers for 50 years
Right.
and not pick up a few of their tricks
A few of the
to
tricks, yeah.
keep things lively. And that's, I attribute it to them. But by the way, I've been looking at that title behind you, Crazy for God,
Yeah,
which I take as yours.
that's a
And
memoir I wrote about 15 years ago, and I just
uh,
keep it back there. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I'm thinking that someone who would write a book with that title would understand this tension between reason and unreason
Totally.
as part of improv.
Yeah, and someday, I'll send you something too sometime, and you'll see that we are amusingly on the same page about a lot of things,
Yeah.
and have been wrestling with similar issues. So you wrote it, it's always like, all right, who are you writing this book for? Well, in your case, you wrote your book for me. So thank you.
The
You
happy
met him.
few. The
Yeah, you
happy
know
few.
him now.
Yeah.
Okay, well, stick around and
Thank you,
talk to
Frank.
Ernie, Greg,
You
please,
bet.
and give us some names. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Randy, this has been great.
It
Thank you.
has.